of all sorts, but he also knew her to be fair in her judgments when once she saw a thing right, and a keen reader of character. He wanted her to see the Hollisters without the least bit of a chance to judge them beforehand. So when the car drew up in front of the old barn, Mrs. Graham was quite unprepared to have her son get out and open the car door and say, " Mother, this is the place. May I help you out?" She had been talking earnestly, and had thought he was getting out to look after something wrong about the car. Now she looked up startled. " Why, Sidney ! Why, you must have made a mistake. This isn't a house. It's a barn." " This is the place, mother. Just come right up this way." Mrs. Graham picked her way over the short green turf up to the door, and stood astonished while her son knocked. What in the world did he mean? Was this one of his jokes? Had he brought her out to see a new riding horse? That must be it, of course. He was always taking a fancy to a horse or a dog. She really hadn't the time to spare for nonsense this afternoon, but one must humor one's son once in a while. She stepped back absent mindedly, her eyes resting on the soft greens and purples of the foliage across the meadows, her thoughts on the next paper she intended to write for the club. This incident would soon be over, and then she might pursue the even tenor of her busy way. Then the door slid back, and she became aware of something unusual in the tenseness of the moment. Looking up quickly, she saw a beautiful girl of about Elizabeth's age, with a wealth of dark wavy hair, lovely dark eyes, and vivid coloring, and by her side one of the loveliest golden haired, blue eyed babies she had ever seen in her life. In the wonder of the moment she forgot that the outside of the building had been a barn, for the curtain had risen on a new setting, and here on the very threshold there opened before her amazed eyes a charming, homelike room. At first she did not take in any of the details of furnishings. Everything was tastefully arranged, and the dull tones of wall and floor and ceiling in the late afternoon light mellowed the old furniture into its background so perfectly that the imperfections and makeshifts did not appear. It was just a place of comfort and beauty, even though the details might show shabby poverty. But her son was speaking. " Mother, this is Miss Carol Hollister, and this little girl is her sister Doris." Doris put out a fat hand and gravely laid it in the lady's kid glove, saying carefully, with shy lashes drooped sideways, and blue eyes furtively searching the stranger's face, " How do?" Then, as if she had performed her duty, she turned on her smiles and dimples with a flash, and grasping Graham's hand, said, " Now, Mr. Dwam, oh, tum out and see my wabbits." It was evident to the mother that her son had been here before. She looked at him for an explanation, but he only said to Carol, " Is your mother able to see callers for a few minutes?" " Oh, yes," said Carol with a glad little ring in her voice. " Mother is up in a chair this afternoon. See? The doctor says she may get up now, she is so much better." And she turned and flung out her arm toward the big easy chair where her mother sat. Mrs. Hollister arose and came forward to meet them. She was dressed in a plain little gown of cheap gray challis, much washed and mended, but looking somehow very nice, and Carol had just finished fastening one of Shirley's sheer white fluffy collars around her neck with a bit of a pink ribbon looped in a pretty knot. Her hair was tastefully arranged, and she looked every inch a lady as she stood to receive her unexpected guests. Graham had never seen her in any but invalid's garb before, and he stood amazed for a moment at the likeness between her and Shirley. He introduced his mother with a few words, and then yielded to Doris's eager pulling hand and went out to see the bunnies. The situation was a trifle trying for both ladies, but to the woman of the world perhaps the more embarrassing. She hadn't a clue as to who this was she had been brought to see. She was entirely used to dominating any situation, but for a moment she was almost confused. Mrs. Hollister, however, tactfully relieved the situation with a gentle, " Won't you sit here by the fire? It is getting a little cool this evening, don't you think?" and put her at once at ease. Only her family would have guessed from the soft pink spots in her cheeks that she was at all excited over her grand guest. She took the initiative at once, leading the talk into natural channels about the spring and its wonderful unfolding in the country, exhibited a vase with Jack in the pulpits and a glass bowl of hepaticas blushing blue and pink, told of the thrush that had built a nest in the elm over the door, and pointed out the view over the valley where the sinking sun was flashing crimson from the weather vane on the little white spire of the church. She said how much they had enjoyed the sunsets since coming out here to live, taking it for granted that her visitor knew all about their circumstances, and making no apologies or comments. And the visitor, being what her son called a good sport, showed no hint that she had never heard of the Hollisters before, but smiled and said the right thing at the right moment. And somehow, neither knew just how, they got to the subject of Browning and Ibsen, and from there to woman suffrage. And when Graham returned with Carol and Harley, Doris chattering beside him and the dog bounding in ahead, they were deep in future politics. Graham sat and listened for a while, interested to note that the quiet little woman who had spent the last few years of her life working in a narrow, dark city kitchen could talk as thoughtfully and sensibly as his cultured, versatile mother. The next trolley brought Shirley and George, and again the mother was amazed to find how altogether free and easy seemed to be the relation between all these young people. She gave a keen look at Shirley and then another at her son, but saw nothing which gave her uneasiness. The girl was unconscious as a rose, and sweet and gracious to the stranger guests as if she had been in society all her life. She slipped away at once to remove her hat, and when she came back her hair was brushed, and she looked as fresh as a flower in her clean white ruffled blouse. The older woman could not take her eyes from her face. What a charming girl to be set among all this shabbiness! For by this time her discriminating eyes had discovered that everything, literally everything, was shabby. Who were these people, and how did they happen to get put here? The baby was ravishingly beautiful, the girls were charming, and the boys looked like splendid, manly fellows. The mother was a product of culture and refinement. Not one word or action had shown that she knew her surroundings were shabby. She might have been mistress of a palace for aught she showed of consciousness of the pitiful poverty about her. It was as if she were just dropped down for the day in a stray barn and making a palace out of it while she stayed. Unconsciously, the woman of the world lingered longer than was her wont in making calls. She liked the atmosphere and was strangely interested by them all. " I wish you would come and see me," she said cordially as she rose at last to go, and she said it as if she meant it, as if she lived right around the corner and not 22 miles away, as if she really wanted her to come, and not as if this other woman lived in a barn at all. " Good old sport !" commented her son in his heart as he listened. He had known she must see their worth, and yet he had been strangely afraid. Mrs. Hollister received the invitation with a flush of pleasure. " Thank you," she answered graciously, " but I'm afraid not. I seldom go anywhere any more, but I've been very glad to have had this call from you. It will be a pleasure to think about. Come some time again when you are out this way. Your son has been most kind. I cannot find words to express my thanks." " Has he ?" and his mother looked questioningly at her son. " Well, I'm very glad." "Yes, and Elizabeth, she is a dear, sweet girl, and we all love her." Revelations! "Oh, has Elizabeth been here too? Well, I'm glad. I hope she has not been a nuisance. She's such an impulsive, erratic child. Elizabeth is quite a problem just now. She's out of school on account of her eyes, and her girl friends, most of them being away at school. She is perfectly forlorn. I am delighted to have her with your children. I am sure they are charming associates for her." And her eyes rested approvingly on the sparkling Carol in her simple school dress of brown linen with its white collar and cuffs. There was nothing countrified about Carol. She looked dainty in the commonest raiment, and she smiled radiantly at Elizabeth's mother and won her heart. " Would you let Elizabeth stay over night with us here some time?" she asked shyly. " Why, surely. I presume she would be delighted. She does about as she pleases these days. I really don't see very much of her. I am so busy this time of year, just at the end of the season, you know, and lots of committee meetings and teas and things." They stopped at the doorway to look up into the big tree in response to the earnest solicitations of Doris, who pulled at the lady's gloved hand insistently, murmuring sweetly, " Birdie, Birdie, seen my birdie in the tree?" The Hollisters stood grouped at the doorway when at last the visitors got into their car and went away. Mrs. Graham looked back at them wistfully. " What a lovely group they make !" she murmured. " Now, Sidney, tell me at once who they are